This is the story of a single room, built from more than 6 tons of fossilized tree resin, that was stolen once, crated twice, and then burned in a castle cellar while 200 separate expeditions spent the next 80 years digging for it in the wrong countries. This is also the story of how the most famous missing object of the Second World War almost certainly went up in flames in April of 1945, and why at least 3 different institutions preferred to call that object lost. Start at the end. In June of 1945, a Soviet archaeologist named Alexander Brusov walked into the burned northern wing of Königsberg Castle, in what had been the capital of East Prussia, and wrote down what covered the floor. Traces of fire, Brusov recorded. Ash heaps, and ash across the entire floor. Buried in that ash, Brusov catalogued something far more specific, which was small pieces of burned wooden strips, parts of cases, parts of moldings, and copper hinges from doors that the Germans had stripped out of the palace at Pushkin and carried to Königsberg along with the amber room. Copper hinges. Not amber, but copper hinges lifted from the same palace, shipped in the same convoy, lying in the ash of the room where the amber room had last been seen by anybody. Brusov's conclusion, filed in the summer of 1945, held that the amber room had burned, and that verdict landed within weeks of the German surrender at Königsberg, delivered by the man the Soviet government itself had dispatched to find it. 80 years later, people are still looking. The amber room has been reported inside a Baltic shipwreck, inside a Polish bunker complex, inside an abandoned German mine shaft, inside a salt working on the Czech border, and beneath a sand dune on a Lithuanian spit. Every one of those searches came back empty. The one authenticated piece of the amber room ever recovered turned up in none of them, and it did not emerge from a hidden Nazi cache at all, because it surfaced in a Bremen living room in 1997, and the evidence shows it was stolen separately, back in 1941, before the room ever reached Königsberg. That is the argument of this documentary. The amber room is not lost, the amber room is gone, and the mystery that grew in its place was manufactured. It has been kept alive by a Soviet institution that could not admit what its own soldiers had probably done, by a German political culture that found the search useful as an act of atonement, and by a treasure-hunting industry that has never once needed to actually find anything in order to keep getting paid. To understand what was destroyed, you have to understand what it was, because the amber room was not a chest, not a hoard, and not a collection of loose objects. The amber room was architecture, a set of wall panels, and the panels themselves were the treasure. The commission dates to 1701, the year Frederick I was crowned king in Prussia, and the new king wanted a room that would humiliate Versailles. Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin was the original intended home, though the panels were actually assembled at the Berlin City Palace, the building known as the Stadtschloss. Designing it fell to Andreas Schluter, the German Baroque sculptor and architect who served as director of royal construction and who had helped design that same Berlin City Palace. Schluter needed a craftsman capable of working amber at architectural scale, which almost nobody on the continent could do. Frederick IV of Denmark supplied the recommendation in 1701, and the man he named was a Danish master carver of amber and ivory called Gottfried Wolfram. 6 years of work followed, and by 1707 Wolfram had finished roughly a quarter of the room. Then the project collapsed twice inside the same year. Andreas Schluter lost favor at court and surrendered the design to Esander von Goethe, while Gottfried Wolfram was dismissed outright after a dispute over payment. 2 amber masters from Danzig inherited the job, Gottfried Thurau, who headed the Danzig Amber Guild, and his partner Ernst Schacht. Here is the technical detail that outweighs every other fact in this story, and it comes back to bite in 1945. The panels rested on a backing of oak, and that oak carried a lining of foil, bronze foil in the technique credited to Wolfram, which both deepened the color of the amber above it and cushioned the movement of the wood beneath it. Amber went onto that foil as mosaic, sawn into slices roughly 5 mm thick. Holding those slices in place was an adhesive of pine resin and beeswax, chosen deliberately because it softened at a low temperature, which meant a damaged patch could be warmed and repaired rather than torn out. Carved elements joined by mortise and tenon, pegged with ivory. Read that construction back as a fire risk and it reads catastrophically. An oak carcass, a resin and wax glue picked for how readily it melts, and a surface of fossil resin. The amber room amounted, structurally, to a wooden wall coated in a flammable organic gemstone and stuck together with something close to candle wax. Late in 1711 the panels stood assembled at the Berlin City Palace, and a Prussian inventory taken in 1713 recorded that the finished panels would cover about 95% of the walls of the room they were built for. That original Prussian chamber ran to more than 74 square meters of surface and stood around 5 meters high. Then, in 1713, Frederick I died. The son who inherited the Prussian throne that year, Friedrich Wilhelm I, remembered ever since as the soldier king, had no use whatsoever for a room made of jewelry. Work stopped, the panels came down, and the whole assembly went into storage in the Berlin Armory. The most expensive decorative object in Northern Europe spent its early years crated up in a building full of muskets. What rescued the room was Russian. Peter the Great admired the amber panels during a Prussian visit, and Friedrich Wilhelm I spotted the opening immediately, because Prussia needed Russia against Sweden and against Charles XII. On the 17th of November, 1716, according to the account published by the Gemological Institute of America in its winter 2018 issue, Friedrich Wilhelm I handed the amber panels to Peter the Great to seal that alliance. 8 large crates carried the panels out of Berlin on the 13th of January, 1717. Their route ran through Königsberg, the city where the room would die 228 years later, and onward through Klaipėda, with the journey taking roughly 6 months. Now the part that everybody skips. This transaction gets described as a gift almost universally, and in Russian and German popular history alike that one word does an enormous amount of quiet work. Peter the Great, however, sent something back. His reciprocal gift arrived in the form of soldiers, tall men for the regiment of oversized grenadiers that Friedrich Wilhelm I collected obsessively, the unit known as the Langkurl, the Potsdam Giants. How many men went east to west is genuinely unclear, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise. German culture gives the figure as 55 choice grenadiers, while the Gemological Institute of America, citing the amber historian Gerlowski, puts it at 40. Somewhere between 40 and 55 human beings changed hands as part of the same diplomatic exchange that moved the amber panels east. That detail reframes the entire object, and it reframes it in a direction both national narratives have reasons to avoid. Germany's version of the Amber Room story leans on a Prussian masterpiece, German-designed, German-carved, generously given away, and eventually, in the phrasing used in Königsberg in 1941, returned home. Russia's version leans on a diplomatic gift, freely offered, then held and expanded and nursed by Russian hands across 2 full centuries. Neither version opens with the grenadiers. The Amber Room was not simply a present, it was one half of a trade, and the tall Prussian soldiers who marched into the Potsdam Regiment belonged to that deal every bit as much as the crates heading out through Königsberg. When the 8 crates reached St. Petersburg, the Governor-General Alexander Menshikov inspected them and reported that there was practically no damage to the amber cabinet. That stands as the first documented condition report on the Amber Room, and the striking thing is that anybody thought a condition report was necessary at all. Everyone who handled this object, from 1717 onward, understood they were moving something that traveled badly. Through its first decades in Russia, the amber panels never stayed put. Installation came first at the Summer Palace, until 1743, when the Empress Elizabeth ordered a transfer to the Third Winter Palace, where the Italian craftsman Alexander Martelli handled the mounting, and by 1746 the chamber served as a reception room. July of 1755 brought another order from Elizabeth, moving the room out of the capital altogether, to the Great Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the building the world now calls the Catherine Palace. A special detachment carried the crates there. Carried them physically, by hand, which tells you how fragile the Russian court already judged these panels to be, less than 40 years after they arrived. Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli inherited the problem at Tsarskoye Selo, and the brief he received was impossible. Prussian panels designed for a room of a little over 74 square meters now had to fill a hall that ran far larger and far taller, with a floor area of about 96 square meters and total wall space the Gemological Institute of America places at roughly 216 square meters. The amber Rastrelli had in hand covered nothing like that. 12 main amber panels, each standing over 3.5 meters high and most of them around 56 centimeters wide, covered 68.5 square meters, with secondary amber elements adding another 5.5. Rastrelli faked the difference, and he faked it brilliantly. Mirrored pilasters filled the gaps, alongside gilded carving and a gilded cornice, and above that cornice, where nobody standing in the room would ever inspect the surface closely, Rastrelli installed painted panels imitating amber. For Florentine stone mosaics went into the walls, works by Giuseppe Zocchi representing allegories of the senses. 24 Venetian mirrors followed, along with a parquet floor and a ceiling painting by Fontabasso. Remember those 4 Zocchi mosaics, because 2 of them decide this entire story. Even then the room remained unfinished, until 1763, when Catherine II ordered the lower tier of painted canvas replaced with real amber. Craftsmen produced 8 flat lower-tier panels, 8 pedestals, an over-door piece, and cornice elements, and according to the Tsarskoye Selo State Museum, that addition consumed 450 kilograms of amber over 4 years, bringing the room to its final appearance in 1770. That 450 kilogram figure has caused endless confusion, and this script flags it rather than repeating the mistake. 450 kilograms describes the weight of Catherine's addition alone, and it is not the weight of the amber room. The real total runs far higher, at more than 6 tons, or around 13,000 pounds, in the figure carried by the standard reference accounts, with Britannica putting it at nearly 6 tons. One further point about the counting, since the numbers attached to this room get thrown around so freely. Reporting from 1997 gives the mosaic panels of the room as 129, and the number of individual amber pieces has been put at around 100,000. Those figures count tesserae and mosaic elements, rather than structural panels, and they swing wildly between sources. This script flags them rather than asserting them, because the gap between 12 main panels and 100,000 pieces is the gap between a wall and a mosaic, and popular accounts routinely blur the two to make the object sound bigger than its documented inventory. What nobody disputes is that the room survived everything the 20th century threw at Russia right up until the war. The amber room came through the Russian Revolution of 1917 intact, still fixed to the walls at Tsarskoye Selo, and it was photographed that year in a hand-colored image by Branson Decoux. A room built from fossil resin, glued with beeswax, mounted on oak, outlasted a revolution, a civil war, and 2 changes of political system. It did not outlast being moved. By 1770 the amber room stood complete, with more than 55 square meters of amber surface backed by oak, glowing against bronze foil, in a hall that was a little under half amber and a little over half theater. Théophile Gautier, the French writer, saw it in the 1860s and described being amazed and blinded by the wealth and warmth of its tints. More than a century afterward, the director of the Tsarskoye Selo Museum, Ivan Satov, captured the effect in 1997 by asking people to picture the western beams of sun entering the room and lighting up the panels. Satov added the line that has trailed the amber room ever since. It was said the room was shining from the inside. Here is the fact that nearly every telling of this story leaves out, and it carries more weight than any other piece of evidence in the case. The amber room was decaying before the war started. Not damaged, not neglected, but decaying chemically, as a direct function of what amber is. Baltic amber is succinite, the fossilized resin of the extinct pine Pinus succinifera, and while that resin sits buried in oxygen-free sediment it stays stable. Remove amber from those anoxic sediments and deterioration begins immediately and never stops. The published conservation literature describes a consistent progression, and that literature includes the National Park Service Conservogram Guidance, work by Bisulka and colleagues published through the American Museum of Natural History in 2012, research from Senckenberg, and a 2025 Springer study on pyrite decay in amber. First, the surface darkens. Crazing follows, a network of fine surface cracks, and from there the cracking drives deeper until the material fractures outright. Ordinary things drive that process. Ultraviolet invisible light, which cause photooxidation and chain scission in the resin polymer. Oxygen. Temperature. Rapid swings in relative humidity. Anyone who has dealt with early plastics, or with the preservation of any polymer-based material, will recognize that failure profile instantly. Amber does not behave like stone, and treating it like stone runs as the mistake threading through this entire story, because amber behaves like an organic polymer that is slowly and irreversibly unzipping. The instruction set for keeping it alive sits far closer to the instruction set for a film archive than for a marble statue, meaning stable temperature, stable humidity, controlled light, and no assumption whatsoever that the object will simply endure because it is old. Every archivist who has watched a cellulose reel go to vinegar understands the principle. Time is not neutral, and for some materials time functions as an active solvent. Apply that to the Catherine Palace in the 1930s. The palace had central heating by the 20th century, and central heating delivered exactly the cycling temperature and falling humidity that drives crazing, which meant the amber was cracking on the walls. A full restoration of the amber room was scheduled for 1941, and it never happened, because in June of 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Anatoly Mikhailovich Kuchumov held the post of chief curator at the Catherine Palace, and had done since 1932. Kuchumov stands as the central human figure in the second half of this story, and everything Kuchumov later did only makes sense once you grasp what Kuchumov knew in the summer of 1941. Secondary accounts report that Kuchumov described the amber that summer as bone-dry, and this script flags that specific phrase as unverified against the archival original. The underlying condition, though, is not in dispute, because the restoration had been scheduled precisely because the room needed one. So the object the German army carried off in October of 1941 was in no condition to be handled at all. 230 years of oak, wax adhesive, and photodegrading fossil resin, already crazed, already overdue for conservation, and now about to be dismantled in a hurry, packed into wooden crates, hauled 800 kilometers, reassembled by different hands in a different climate, then dismantled again, crated again, and stored in the cellar of a castle in a city about to be bombed twice and then besieged. The real question at the end of this documentary is not whether the Amber Room survived a fire. The question is whether the Amber Room could have survived anything. Operation Barbarossa opened on the 22nd of June, 1941, and the Catherine Palace at Pushkin, just south of Leningrad, sat directly in the path of Army Group North. Soviet museum staff had a plan for exactly this contingency, which was that everything portable would be evacuated east. The Amber Room turned out not to be portable, and Anatoly Kuchumov discovered that by trying. The evacuation failed for the reason already established. When the staff started removing the amber came away in pieces, because the material had grown too brittle. Those panels had clung to the walls since 1755, through nearly 2 centuries of Russian winters and then decades of central heating, and they now sat in the exact condition that had prompted the scheduled 1941 restoration. Kuchumov's team stopped, because carrying on would have destroyed the room in the act of saving it. Kuchumov and the Catherine Palace staff fell back on the only other option available, which was to hide it in place. Wallpaper went over the Amber Room, with accounts also describing cloth and padding, plus sand laid across the floor as a fire precaution. The most famous room in the palace was disguised as a blank wall. That deception held for a matter of weeks. German forces took Pushkin in September of 1941, with some accounts giving the 17th of September, and the wallpaper fooled nobody. German officers arriving at the Catherine Palace knew exactly what stood inside that building, because the Amber Room ranked among the most documented interiors in Europe and its Prussian origin counted as a matter of national pride in Berlin. Kuchumov did not see the palace again until March of 1944, after the Germans had been driven back, and what Kuchumov wrote at that point survives as one of the few genuinely personal fragments in the entire archive. The sculptures are without heads. The parquet and fireplaces are smashed and broken. If only the walls could talk. Hold that sentence for a moment. Kuchumov, standing in a gutted palace, writing that the walls cannot talk. 2 years later the same man would be handed testimony from a witness who watched the Amber Room burn, and would decide the testimony was wrong. Stripping the Amber Room out of the Catherine Palace was no smash and grab, because trained personnel with museum expertise carried it out, which is precisely what makes the institutional question around it so knotty. Supervising the dismantling was Rittmeister Graf Sohmslaubach, an officer of the Wehrmacht Kunstschutz, the German Army's Ark Protection Service, working alongside his colleague George Poensgen. The Kunstschutz existed, on paper at least, to safeguard cultural property in occupied territory, and, in France its head, Count Wolf Metternich, actively obstructed the looting run by Alfred Rosenberg's organization. That institutional friction matters here, because the Amber Room seizure gets attributed wholesale to the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, and the record is messier than that. What the record supports runs as follows. Kunstschutz officers, Sohmslaubach and Poensgen, ran the physical dismantling and shipment of the Amber Room. The ERR, according to the German Amber history reference Bernstein-Mobile.de, asserted ownership and registered the Amber Room as its own acquisition. Documentation through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Claims Conference Jeux de Paume database establishes the ERR as the agency behind the systematic looting of Jewish-owned art across occupied Europe, yet the ERR's specific operational role in this particular seizure remains contested and thin in the surviving record, and this documentary will not overstate it. 2 German institutions had their hands on the Amber Room, and they were not the same institution. 36 hours, according to the reported figure, covered the dismantling itself. That 36-hour number appears identically across the standard accounts, the Smithsonian, HistoryNet, the Gemological Institute of America, and the reference literature, which is exactly the pattern you see when a single original source gets repeated rather than independently confirmed. This script flags it as the standard claim rather than a verified one. The crates left Pushkin on the 14th of October, 1941. Most accounts give 27 crates, while HistoryNet gives 28. 27 or 28 wooden cases, filled with panels that had just been prized off a wall by men racing a clock, from a surface that had shattered when Soviet conservators attempted the same thing weeks earlier. Consider what that means physically. Soviet staff, working carefully, with the museum's own tools and no deadline beyond the advancing front, had abandoned the attempt because the amber was disintegrating. A German team, working in a day and a half, got it into crates. Only one explanation makes both of those facts true, which is that the German team accepted damage the Soviet team refused to accept. Whatever went into those 27 crates was no longer the room Théophile Gautier described. Königsberg was the destination, the capital of East Prussia, and that choice was anything but random. Erich Koch had held the post of Gauleiter of East Prussia since 1928, alongside the posts of Reichskommissar for Ukraine and for the Ostland. Königsberg was Koch's fief, and Königsberg sat on the Baltic Amber Coast, which handed the transfer of propaganda logic Berlin found irresistible. Alfred Rohde received the crates. Rohde directed the city art collections of Königsberg and ranked as a genuine amber specialist who had published treatises on the material. Alfred Rohde is the last person on record to have laid eyes on the amber room, and Rohde is the reason the mystery has any documentary spine at all. The Königsberger Allgemeine Zeitung reported the display on the 13th of November, 1941. A German ledger records the arrival at Königsberg in December of 1941. August of 1942 brought the public opening, in the Rittersaal, the Knights' Hall, of Königsberg Castle. Secondary accounts preserve the framing used at the time, and this script flags the exact wording as unverified, which described the amber room as having returned to its homeland. That framing is a lie with a true fact buried inside it. The panels were Prussian-made, carved in Berlin by a Dane and two men from Danzig for a Prussian king. They had also been Russian property for 225 years, enlarged by an Italian architect for a Russian empress, extended with 450 kilograms of additional amber on the order of a Russian ruler, and tended by Russian conservators until the week the German army arrived. Calling that a homecoming required ignoring two-thirds of the object's life. One thing the Königsberg exhibition proves beyond argument, and it becomes decisive in 1997. German photographs record what hung on the walls when the amber room was reassembled in the Knights' Hall, and one of Giuseppe Zocchi's 4 Florentine mosaics was already missing. That mosaic had not burned. That mosaic had not been hidden by retreating Germans in 1945. Somebody on the transport stole it in 1941, somewhere between the Catherine Palace and Königsberg Castle, and 56 years later it turned up in Bremen. For 2 years the amber room sat in the Knights' Hall of Königsberg Castle as an exhibit, with Alfred Rohde running it. That ended when the air war reached East Prussia. August of 1944 brought the Royal Air Force to Königsberg on 2 consecutive raid nights. The standard bombing histories give those nights as the 26th to 27th and the 29th to 30th of August, 1944, and this script notes that some amber room accounts single out the night of the 26th alone. Fire gutted the city's historic core. Königsberg Castle took heavy damage, and across the war as a whole roughly 80% of Königsberg was destroyed. That marks the turning point in the physical history of the object. From late 1943 and into early 1944, Rohde had been advised to take the amber room down and crate it for protection, and after the August raids the argument was settled. Off the walls of the Knights' Hall it came, for the second time in 3 years, and back into wooden cases. Consider the cumulative mechanical history of these panels by the end of 1944. Removed from Berlin storage in 1717. Installed, removed, and reinstalled 3 times in Russia between 1717 and 1755. Adapted and extended twice. Left undisturbed for 170 years while central heating dried and crazed the surface. Prized off a wall in 36 hours by a military team in October 1941. Trucked and railed to the Baltic coast, reassembled by a 4th set of hands inside a stone castle, and now taken down again and boxed. Amber does not heal. Each one of those handling events pushed a network of surface crazing further toward structural fracture, and the conservation literature is unambiguous that the process runs one way only. By late 1944, whatever sat inside those crates in Königsberg Castle amounted to a badly degraded object being stored, rather than a masterpiece being protected. Now the number that settles the argument on its own. Amber melts, according to the National Park Service conservation guidance, at between 295 and 395 degrees Celsius. That is not the temperature at which amber suffers damage, that is the temperature at which amber stops being a solid. A structure fire in a stone building, feeding on burning oak crates, oak panel backings, parquet, and roof timbers, passes through that range early and stays above it. The pine resin and beeswax adhesive gripping every single slice had been formulated, deliberately, to soften at a temperature far lower still. That is the material reality every hidden treasure theory has to argue its way around, and it explains why the last documented movement of the Amber Room carries so much weight. On the 12th of January, 1945, Alfred Rhodey wrote a line quoted in every subsequent investigation: "I am packing the Amber Room." A letter of the same date reportedly states that the room was being packed for transport to a castle in Saxony. The 12th of January, 1945. The following day, the Soviet East Prussian offensive opened. What happened to East Prussia between January and April of 1945 supplies the context that makes every later theory about the Amber Room either plausible or absurd, so precision matters here. The Soviet East Prussian offensive began on the 13th of January, 1945, one day after Alfred Rhodey wrote that he was packing the Amber Room. Within weeks, land routes out of East Prussia were severed. The German evacuation that followed, Operation Hannibal, pushed civilians and military personnel out through the Baltic ports, producing the largest maritime evacuation and some of the worst maritime disasters in history. Königsberg itself was besieged and then stormed, and on the 9th of April, 1945, General Otto Lasch surrendered the city in defiance of Hitler's orders. That is the window in which the Amber Room either left Königsberg or did not, and everything hangs on those 12 weeks. The case for the room leaving is straightforward and deserves a fair hearing. Rhodey stated in writing that he was packing it. A destination in Saxony appears in the reporting, and ships and trains genuinely did leave Königsberg and the nearby port of Pillow in those final weeks, carrying cargo west under Operation Hannibal. Total chaos, fragmentary records, and a German administration in East Prussia with every reason to move a prestige object out of a city about to fall. The case against is equally straightforward and rests on one simple observation. Rhodey wrote that he was packing the Amber Room on the 12th of January, and nobody in 80 years has produced a document showing that the crates left. No shipping manifest, no railway bill, no receipt at a Saxon castle, no German officer's account of a delivery. 80 years of archival work in German, Soviet, Polish, and East German files, including the search files maintained by the KGB and the Stasi, has yielded no transport record whatsoever. What that archival work yielded instead was the testimony of the people inside the castle at the end. One clarification is owed here, because this channel covers the East Prussian campaign regularly and the two histories sit on top of each other geographically without connecting evidentially. Nothing in this research documents any forced labor or concentration camp labor connection to the handling, crating, transport, or storage of the Amber Room. Every named individual who touched this object came from German museum or military personnel, meaning Sohnslobach, Poensgen, and Rhodey. That deserves stating plainly rather than implying through proximity. What did unfold in the same province, in the same weeks, belongs to a separate and far heavier history. A Stutthof concentration camp subcamp at Königsberg held roughly 500 Jewish prisoners as forced labor in 1944 and 1945, part of a regional network of Stutthof subcamps that took in Serapen, Jisso, Heiligenbale, Schippenbiel, and Gerdauen. As the front collapsed, prisoners from those subcamps were concentrated at Königsberg and marched to the coast at Pomnichen, the town known today as Yantarny and the site of the largest amber mine on the Baltic. According to the documentation compiled at Juseneast a massacre of approximately 3,000 Jewish inmates of the Stutthof camp system was carried out during the night of the 31st of January to the 1st of February, 1945. The same source records 13,000 people, mostly women, rounded up from the subcamps to Königsberg. Other figures diverge, with up to 7,000 force-marched in one account, and at least 5,000 with only 30 survivors in another. The historian Andreas Kossert examined the episode in the Leo Beck Institute yearbook in 2004. Between that history and the Amber Room the connection is geographic and thematic, and it is not evidentiary. The Amber Coast produced the material, and the Amber Coast produced that. Both facts belong in an honest account of East Prussia in 1945, and neither should be used to decorate the other. In May of 1945, 1 month after the surrender of Königsberg, the Soviet Council of People's Commissars dispatched an investigator to find the Amber Room, and that investigator was Alexander Ivanovich Brusov, of the State Historical Museum in Moscow. Brusov's inspection carries the date of the 5th of June, 1945, and Brusov filed his report that same month. This stands as the earliest professional examination of the site, conducted 6 weeks after the city fell, by a Soviet specialist working for the Soviet government, before any Cold War narrative existed to bend the answer. Brusov went into the northern wing of Königsberg Castle. What Brusov recorded there, in the rendering given by the investigative journalists Catherine Scott Clark and Adrian Levy in their 2004 book on the subject, ran as follows. Traces of fire. Ash heaps and ash covering the entire floor. Small pieces of burned wooden strips in parts of cases, parts of moldings, and copper hinges from the doors, which were taken by Germans from Pushkin and moved to Königsberg along with the amber room. Take those findings one at a time, because the meaning lives in the specificity. Burned wooden strips. When the amber room's panels were built on oak backings and its amber was set in strips and slices. Parts of cases. When the amber room had been packed into crates in 1944 and, according to Rodi, was being packed again in January 1945. Copper hinges from doors taken from Pushkin, and that is the item nobody can explain away. Those hinges were never Königsberg fittings, because those hinges came out of the Catherine Palace, in the same German shipment as the amber room, and they lay in the ash of the room where the amber room had last been exhibited. Brusov also had a witness. Paul Feyerabend had managed the restaurant inside Königsberg Castle, and Feyerabend told Brusov that the amber room was in crates at the moment of surrender and burned there later during a fire that destroyed the northern wing of the edifice. Notice what Feyerabend's statement does and does not claim. Feyerabend never says the Germans burned it. Feyerabend says the crates were still in the castle when Königsberg surrendered on the 9th of April, and that the fire came afterwards. Brusov concluded that fire had destroyed the amber room, and that was the finding of the first official investigation, filed in June of 1945. One point of precision, because this documentary flags its own sources. The often repeated formulation that the amber room was destroyed between the 9th and the 11th of April, 1945, does not appear verbatim in the strongest renderings of Brusov's report. Feyerabend's account and a later Russian press account both point to a fire after the 9th of April surrender, with one account giving the 12th. This script treats the 9 to 11 April dating as attributed rather than firmly established. What is established is the sequence, meaning crates present at surrender, fire afterwards, and ash and Pushkin hinges on the floor in June. Brusov had the answer within 8 weeks, and within 9 months the Soviet Union sent a second investigator to overturn it. Anatoly Kuchumov arrived in Königsberg on the 19th of March, 1946. Kuchumov was chief curator of the Catherine Palace, the man in post since 1932, the man whose evacuation attempt had collapsed in 1941, and the man who had left the amber room on the wall behind a sheet of wallpaper. That biography is not incidental, that biography is the whole of it. Searching the ruins of Königsberg Castle, Kuchumov found what his 1946 report describes as 3 stone mosaic pictures that once decorated the amber room, totally burned and discolored, and covered in 3 layers of ash. 3. Giuseppe Zocchi had made 4. On that arithmetic, 3 burned mosaics recovered and 1 unaccounted for. Anatoly Kuchumov constructed the theory that has consumed 80 years and hundreds of expeditions. Kuchumov argued that the missing 4th mosaic proved the amber room had not all burned together, and proposed that the amber panels themselves had been packed and removed separately from the mosaics before the fire, leaving them hidden somewhere, waiting to be found. Kuchumov rejected Alexander Brusov's finding outright. Here is the fact the treasure-hunting literature almost never places beside that rejection. On the 2nd of April, 1946, Anatoly Kuchumov interrogated Paul Feyerabend, the same castle restaurant manager who had testified to Brusov the previous year, and Feyerabend gave Kuchumov the identical account. The amber room was in the Knights' Hall, in crates, and it burned. Kuchumov heard the eyewitness testimony directly, from the same witness, in his own interrogation, and promoted the concealment theory anyway. That is the moment the mystery was manufactured. Not by a Nazi officer stashing crates in a mine, but by a Soviet curator, in a Soviet-occupied city, 11 months after the German surrender, selecting an interpretation the evidence in front of him did not support. Why he did it is worth explaining, and this documentary offers the explanation as interpretation rather than fact, because motive is never a document. Consider Anatoly Kuchumov's position in March of 1946. Kuchumov was the custodian who had failed to evacuate the single most famous object in the Soviet museum system, who had covered it with wallpaper and lost it inside a month. If the amber room had burned, then the amber room was gone permanently, and the man responsible would spend the rest of his professional life as the curator who lost the amber room. If the amber room was hidden, then recovery remained possible, and the failure of 1941 shrank from an ending into a chapter. Kuchumov spent the remainder of his career on the second version. Late in life, in a manuscript rendered by Scott Clark and Levy, Kuchumov wrote that the Amber Room did not die, that this masterpiece could not have been deliberately destroyed, and that it is only a question of time before it is found. Read that middle clause closely, because it is not an argument from evidence. This masterpiece could not have been deliberately destroyed. That is a statement about what ought to be true, written by a man who could not accept a conclusion, and written by the person best placed on earth to know that the conclusion was probably correct. The institution above Kuchumov had its own reasons to prefer that version, which brings this documentary to its central claim. The thesis advanced by Catherine Scott Clark and Adrian Levy, in their 2004 book built on Kuchumov's papers and on Soviet and East German archives, holds that Alexander Brusov was right, that the Amber Room burned in Königsberg Castle, that undisciplined Red Army soldiers quite likely started the fire in the days after the 9th of April surrender, and that Soviet authorities understood this early and buried it. Follow the incentive. If German bombing or German demolition destroyed the Amber Room, that is a war crime committed by the enemy, and it is useful. If fire destroyed the Amber Room in a captured city after the surrender, in a building under Soviet control, then the greatest Russian cultural treasure of the imperial era burned at the hands of the army that had just liberated the country. That second version goes beyond embarrassing, because in the memory politics of the Great Patriotic War that second version is unsayable. The lost version solved every problem at once. Lost meant the fascists had stolen it and hidden it, which slotted neatly into the established narrative of German cultural plunder. Lost meant nobody had to carry blame. Lost meant Kuchumov kept his professional standing. Lost also handed the Soviet Union, and later the Russian Federation, a permanent standing claim against Germany in the long unresolved dispute over trophy art and wartime cultural restitution, a dispute that stays open to this day, with large quantities of German-origin cultural property still held in Russia. An object proven destroyed generates no claim. An object still missing generates a claim forever. There is a physical footnote to this that is either coincidence or is not. The ruins of Königsberg Castle, the building where Brusov found the ash, the burned strips, the crate fragments, and the Pushkin hinges, were demolished on Soviet order in 1967 and 1968. The last known location of the Amber Room, and the primary crime scene of the investigation, was leveled. This script presents that as consistent with the suppression argument rather than as proof of it, since ruined castles in Soviet Kaliningrad came down for many reasons. The site is gone, and it was the Soviet state that removed it. Germany, meanwhile, developed the opposite incentive and arrived in the same place. Across post-war German cultural politics, the Amber Room functioned as an open account, since German forces had taken the room from a Russian palace, which meant that if it still existed it could be found and returned, and the finding and returning would constitute an act of atonement with a physical object at the end of it. Guilt with a deliverable. German public engagement with the Amber Room search, the amateur diggers, the retired engineers with radar equipment, the local officials announcing discoveries, does not read as cynical at all, it reads as sincere. That engagement also depends structurally on the room still existing, and sincerity is not evidence. The result is a mystery with three separate institutional sponsors, none of whom benefit from a resolution, and that produces a very particular kind of economic object, one that turns up in other fields entirely. Think about what a treasure hunt actually is as a market. There is a claimed asset, the asset has never been verified, has never been delivered, and cannot be independently valued, and yet the claim itself trades, attracting funding, media coverage, expedition budgets, television commissions, book advances, and government attention. Everyone who profits does so purely from activity around the claim, and none of them get paid on delivery. A find would kill the revenue stream, while a near find sustains it indefinitely. Any market analyst would recognize that structure instantly, along with its most important property. Failure is not a problem for the participants, failure is the business model. 80 years of unsuccessful searching has not weakened the Amber Room industry, because 80 years of unsuccessful searching has been the Amber Room industry. Every long-running treasure mystery eventually collects a body count, and the Amber Room collected one early. The so-called curse of the Amber Room is folklore, and this documentary labels it as folklore, though the individual deaths are real, and two of them matter for reasons that have nothing to do with curses. Alfred Rohde comes first. The director of Königsberg's city art collections, the Amber specialist, the last man documented as handling the crates, remained in the city after the Soviet capture. Rodi and his wife both died in December of 1945 of typhus in the standard accounts, with some giving typhoid, which reads as entirely ordinary in a city that had been besieged, stormed, and reduced to rubble, where roughly 80% of the built environment lay destroyed and disease ran unchecked. Less ordinary is the aftermath. According to the accounts circulating around the Rodi case, the bodies were never subsequently located, and neither was the doctor who signed the death certificates. This script flags that as the standard reported claim rather than an archivally confirmed one. That sequence, where the one man who could definitively answer the question dies of natural causes weeks before the investigation begins and the paperwork trail evaporates, is precisely the sort of detail that keeps a mystery breathing regardless of what it actually means. Epidemic typhus in a destroyed city in December 1945 is not a suspicious cause of death, it is the most likely cause of death. Alfred Rodi died in December 1945, while Alexander Brusov filed in June 1945, which means Rodi was alive and in Soviet-held Königsberg throughout Brusov's investigation, and Rodi's death slammed the door on any later re-examination. Everything after 1945 rests on inference from the physical evidence and on third-party testimony, because the custodian was gone. Erich Koch supplies the second death, and Koch's case is genuinely extraordinary. The Gauleiter of East Prussia fled Königsberg and was captured by British forces in Hamburg in 1949, handed to Poland, tried between 1958 and 1959, and sentenced to death on 9 March 1959. The Polish court convicted Koch in connection with the deaths of around 400,000 Poles, with other accounts of the case citing 72,000 Poles killed and around 200,000 deported to labor camps. Erich Koch was never executed. Poor health and low body weight became the grounds for commuting the sentence to life imprisonment, and Koch died in prison at Barksau on 12 November, 1986. That date deserves stating precisely, because a great many popular accounts of the Amber Room give 1987, and they are wrong. What sat behind that commutation is why it matters. Both the Polish Security Service and the Soviet KGB reportedly wanted Koch kept alive in the hope that Koch would eventually reveal where the Amber Room had gone. A man convicted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people was kept breathing for 27 years, in part, because two intelligence services believed he knew the location of a set of wall panels. Koch never told them anything, for a reason that becomes obvious the moment it is stated. In his only television interview, shortly before his death, Erich Koch said that he had not had time to concern himself with wooden crates, and the art newspaper reported that in 1992. That answer is almost certainly true. In January of 1945, Erich Koch was a regional Nazi administrator watching his province being overrun and organizing his own escape from a collapsing front. The idea that Koch personally supervised the concealment of a museum exhibit belongs to the treasure literature rather than to the situation as it actually existed. George Stein supplies the third death, and Stein represents the human cost of the search itself. Born in Königsberg in 1923 or 1924, a former Soviet prisoner of war, George Stein became the most persistent private investigator of the Amber Room question in Germany. Stein was no fraud, because in 1973 Stein proved instrumental in the return of looted art to the Soviet Union and earned the Order of St. Vladimir for it, with the work financed in part by Baron Eduard von Falswein. A Bavarian forest is where George Stein was found dead in the summer of 1987, his abdomen slashed with a scalpel. The death was ruled a suicide. Popular accounts routinely call it a murder, and this script flags that as disputed. Nobody disputes that Stein had poured decades and his own resources into the search, and had found nothing. The rest of the curse runs thinner. The chain usually adds a Soviet intelligence officer, given as General Gusev, said to have died in a car crash after speaking to a journalist, and this script marks that as unverified, since the identity and role of that officer cannot be independently confirmed in the sources. Set the mysticism aside and look at what the three deaths actually describe. A museum director dead of typhus in a destroyed city. A convicted mass murderer kept alive by two intelligence services for a quarter century because they believed a rumor. A decent, obsessive private citizen who spent his life on a search with no object and died alone in a forest. There is no curse in that. There is a pattern, and the pattern is that the Amber Room has cost more lives to look for than it ever cost to build. More than 130 separate locations have been named as the Amber Room's hiding place, across more than 200 searches, and not one has produced a panel. Reviewing them in sequence does not give you a list of near misses, it gives you a demonstration of method failure. Start with the sea. The most durable maritime theory ties the Amber Room to the Wilhelm Gustloff, the German liner torpedoed by a Soviet submarine on the 30th of January, 1945, with eyewitnesses claiming crates were loaded aboard. Divers have worked that wreck repeatedly across decades, and nothing connected to the Amber Room has ever come out of it, which leaves that theory effectively dead. The current maritime candidate is the steamer Karlsruhe, and it deserves serious treatment because it is the only recent search carrying genuinely new physical evidence. In September of 2020, the Polish diving team Baltic located the wreck of the Karlsruhe off Ustka, at a depth of about 88 meters. The Karlsruhe had left the port of Palo near Königsberg around the 11th or 12th of April, 1945, as part of Operation Hannibal, carrying 1,083 people and roughly 360 tons of cargo, and Soviet aircraft sank the Karlsruhe on the 13th of April, 1945, leaving around 113 survivors. Sealed crates of unknown contents lay in the wreck. Tomasz Stakora, the Baltic tech diver, framed the case carefully, saying the team did not want to get excited, and that if the Germans were to take the Amber Room across the Baltic Sea, then the Karlsruhe steamer was their last chance. That is an honest statement of a real possibility, and this documentary will not wave it away. Notice the date, though. The Karlsruhe sailed from Palo on or about the 11th of April, while Königsberg had surrendered on the 9th of April, and Feyerabend's testimony places the Amber Room crates inside Königsberg Castle at the moment of surrender, in a city then under Soviet control. For the Amber Room to have ridden the Karlsruhe, the crates would have had to leave a Soviet-occupied castle, cross a captured city, and reach a port 30 kilometers away, after the German garrison had already capitulated. That is the load-bearing problem with the Karlsruhe theory, and no quantity of sealed crates on the seabed resolves it. On land, the search record looks worse. The Mamerki bunker complex in Poland has generated 2 separate rounds of publicity. In 2016, the head of the site museum, Bartłomiej Plebenczyk, reported a georadar anomaly consistent with a concealed chamber. Drilling followed that year, and the drilling produced nothing. In 2023, a buried railway installation and wagons surfaced at the site, and the speculation restarted. No Amber Room. At Düsseldorf in Germany in 2008, the town's mayor announced, on the basis of an electromagnetic survey, that around 2 tons of gold, along with a cavern that might hold the Amber Room, had been located, and stated publicly that he was well over 90% certain the Amber Room had been found. Nothing was recovered, and the claim was quietly dropped. At Wuppertal, a group of retirees led by Karl-Heinz Klein dug from 2008 onward, with the search leaning in part on one member's claimed seventh sense. Nothing was found. In 2017, 3 German researchers, Leonard Blum, Peter Lohr, and Gunter Eckhart, announced a location derived from archival deduction and radar. Nothing was found. Add the rest of the standing list. The Ore Mountains, the Erzgebirge, salt mines on the Czech border, the dunes of the Curonian Spit, a lagoon in Lithuania. All unconfirmed, all empty. For calibration, set beside them the Volgic gold train of 2015, the Polish sensation in which 2 men claim to have located an armored Nazi train full of treasure using ground-penetrating radar, generating international coverage and producing nothing at all. The Amber Room search operates inside exactly that media ecology. Underneath the searches sits a documentary problem that rarely gets discussed. Treasure hunters have circulated forged and dubious documents for decades, and Scott Clark and Levy describe an environment of shadowy informants trading questionable information for hard cash. The KGB and the East German Stasi both maintained Amber Room search files across many years, and those files have since been mined for clues by people with a financial incentive to find them. That is the evidentiary base of the survival theory. No manifest, no receipt, just radar anomalies, paid informants, intelligence service speculation, and a mayor's press conference. In May of 1997, in the German city of Bremen, a man named Meinhard Kaiser approached an antiques dealer offering an item for sale at around $2.5 million. That item was a Florentine stone mosaic, one of Giuseppe Zocchi's 4 allegories of the senses, the panel known as touch and smell, and it had come out of the Amber Room. This counts as the single authenticated recovery in the entire 80-year history of the search, and everything about how it emerged cuts against the treasure narrative. German police traced the mosaic to a man named Rudi Wurst, whose father had served in the SS unit escorting the 1941 Amber Room transport from the Catherine Palace to Königsberg. No cave produced this mosaic, no mine, no bunker, no shipwreck. The mosaic had sat in a German family's possession since the war, taken by a soldier on the convoy, and it surfaced only because an heir tried to sell it. Apply the German photographic record from Königsberg Castle, and the case closes. Photographs of the Amber Room reassembled in the Knights Hall for the 1942 exhibition show one of the 4 Zöki mosaics already missing from the wall. Touch and Smell never reached Königsberg, because Touch and Smell was stolen in transit, in 1941, by someone on the escort. That single fact rearranges the entire evidentiary picture, and it rearranges it in favor of the destruction thesis rather than against it. Look at what Anatoly Kuchemov's whole concealment theory rested on. Kuchemov found 3 burned mosaics in the ruins of Königsberg Castle in 1946 and concluded, from the absence of the 4th, that the Amber Room had been separated and hidden before the fire. The 4th mosaic, however, was not hidden by retreating Germans in 1945, because the 4th mosaic sat in a private house in Germany, and had done since 1941, stolen 4 years earlier by a soldier on the transport. The missing 4th mosaic, the founding anomaly of the entire mystery, the gap that launched 200 expeditions, had a mundane explanation the whole time. Kuchemov's arithmetic ran 3 of 4 burned, which meant something had been removed. The correct arithmetic runs 3 of 4 burned, and the 4th was never there to burn. An amber chest of drawers associated with the room also surfaced in Germany, with one account describing it as bought by a woman from Stasi art traders in the 1970s, alongside a commode returned from Berlin. Consider what the physical record actually amounts to, after 80 years, more than 130 reported locations, and more than 200 searches. 3 Zöki mosaics, found burned, discolored, and under 3 layers of ash, in the ruins of Königsberg Castle in 1946. 1 Zöki mosaic, found intact in Bremen in 1997, stolen separately in 1941, which never entered the castle at all. Copper hinges from the Catherine Palace, burned wooden strips, and crate fragments, in the ash of the northern wing in June of 1945. 76 amber fragments. That is the complete inventory of physical evidence. Every authenticated item associated with the Amber Room since 1945 is either burned, or was removed before the room ever reached Königsberg. Not one authenticated item has ever emerged from a concealed wartime cache. 80 years of searching for hidden crates has produced exactly 0 hidden crates, and the mosaic that was hidden turned out to be the one nobody was looking for. The Bremen case establishes one more thing that cuts directly against the survival theory, which is a working principle about how looted objects actually behave. Stolen art does not stay buried, stolen art surfaces, because it is stolen in order to be owned, and ownership eventually passes to an heir who does not share the original thief's reasons for silence. Touch and Smell surfaced after 56 years for exactly that reason. Since a soldier took it, the soldier's family kept it, and a descendant tried to convert it into money. The amber chest surfaced through art traders in the 1970s. That is the normal life cycle of wartime plunder, and it has played out thousands of times across Europe since 1945. 6 tons of amber architecture, in 27 crates, cannot be quietly inherited. It cannot be sold discreetly, and it cannot be moved without equipment and without people knowing. Had the Amber Room been concealed rather than destroyed, 80 years runs far longer than the material has ever taken to leak, through an heir, a deathbed statement, a dealer, an insurance claim, or a defector's file. Nothing has leaked, from any of 4 countries' archives, in 8 decades. For a hidden object, that silence is not mysterious, that silence is impossible. Every article written about the Amber Room carries a number, and the numbers are extraordinary. The Amber Room was worth $142 million. The Amber Room was worth up to $500 million. $250 million. £120 million. £240 million. $190 million in 2021 terms. Where those figures come from is a question with an uncomfortable answer, which is that nobody has ever shown their working. The $142 million figure traces to Smithsonian Magazine, which reported that historians estimate the room was worth that in present-day dollars at the time it was installed, and secondary accounts date that valuation to 2007 and note that it adjusts to roughly $190 million by 2021. Reporting by United Press International in 2016 produced the $500 million figure, carried in reference sources as a valuation of over $500 million as of that year. The other figures drift through the coverage without clear attribution. Not one of those numbers rests on a published methodology. No comparable sale exists, because there has never been another Amber Room. No insurance valuation sits in the public record. No auction history exists, because the object has never touched a market. The one solid economic data point in the research comes from Scott Clark and Levy, who record that at the time of the room's manufacture, amber ran 12 times more valuable than gold. That is a real and useful figure, because it explains why a Prussian king would commission such a thing in the first place, and it explains how a room the size of a modest apartment could plausibly rank as the most expensive interior in Europe in 1711. It describes the amber market of the early 18th century, though, and it cannot be converted into a modern valuation. The amber room valuation problem is a textbook case of something that appears wherever a unique asset has no market. Price requires comparison, and a number gets generated when two parties transact, or when an appraiser can point to something similar enough that has transacted. Strip out all comparables and the price does not climb, the price becomes undefined. What happens next is instructive, and anyone who has watched a speculative market operate will recognize it immediately. Where there is no defensible number, a number gets invented anyway, because reporting, insurance, politics, and journalism all demand one. Once a figure enters circulation, it stops functioning as an estimate and starts functioning as a citation. The 142 million gets quoted because it was quoted. The 500 million gets quoted because it was quoted. Each repetition adds credibility without adding a single piece of underlying analysis. This matters for more than accuracy, because those numbers are the fuel supply of the search industry. A $500 million price justifies an expedition budget, a television commission, a drilling permit, a diving season. The valuation is not a description of the amber room, the valuation is the business case for looking for it. A truthful position is simpler and less useful to everybody involved. 6 tons of 18th century amber architecture is what the amber room amounted to, and it cannot be replaced, cannot be compared, and has never been sold. The correct figure is not $500 million. The correct figure is that there is no figure. In 1979, the Soviet government made a decision that says more about the state of the evidence than any statement ever issued on the subject, because the Soviet government began building a replacement. Consider the logic. If the amber room was hidden, and if it was only a question of time before it was found, which is exactly what Anatoly Kuchumov was still writing, then constructing a full-scale reconstruction at enormous expense makes very little sense. Reconstruction is what an institution commissions once it has privately concluded that the original is never coming back. Officially the search continued, while operationally, in 1979, the Soviet Union started over. The technical problem was severe, and the solution to it stands as the most impressive part of the modern history of this object. Rebuilding a destroyed room from documentation alone was the task, and the documentation amounted to this: approximately 86 black and white photographs, 1 surviving color slide, 76 recovered amber fragments, Rastrelli-era paperwork, plus a signed amber chest by Gottfried Thurau, the same Danzig master who had worked on the original panels after Wolfram's dismissal, held in the Catherine Palace collection, which let the modern craftsman study the original technique directly. 86 photographs, nearly all of them monochrome, of a room whose entire character was color. That is where the reconstruction turns into a genuine feat of forensic craft rather than a copying exercise. Black and white photography records tone and form, and it does not record hue, which meant the restorers had to derive the color scheme of a 6-ton amber mosaic from a single color transparency, 76 physical fragments, and the documented practice of the 18th century Danzig amber trade. The team eventually worked with around 350 distinct shades of amber to reproduce the graded, glowing surfaces Théophile Gautier had described. Material came from the Kaliningrad region, the same Baltic amber coast that had supplied the original, in what is now Russian territory containing the great mine at Yantarny. The yield was brutal. The restorer B. Igdalov told Radio Free Europe in August of 1999 that every kilogram of amber provides only about 150 grams of usable material. 85% waste. To rebuild a room demanding more than 6 tons of finished amber surface, at that yield, the workshops had to process an order of magnitude more raw stone than the finished object contains. Around 50 craftsmen worked on the reconstruction. Something in those 86 photographs deserves a pause, because the same problem now shows up in a completely different field. Soviet conservators photographed the amber room in the 1930s because they were preparing the restoration scheduled for 1941, meaning they were documenting a condition survey. Nobody in that photographic team believed they were creating a backup of a doomed object. They were doing routine professional record keeping ahead of a maintenance job that never happened. That routine record keeping is the only reason the room exists in any form today. An invasion cancelled the restoration, the object burned, the documentation survived, and the documentation turned out to be the asset. Every digital archivist, every engineering firm keeping as-built drawings, and every organization that has ever lost a system without its schematics learns that lesson the hard way. The record of a thing can outlive the thing, and the value of documentation stays invisible right up until the moment it becomes the only thing left. Visitors walking through the amber room today are not looking at something descended from the amber, they are looking at something descended from the filing cabinet. The reconstruction begun in 1979 did not run smoothly, for a straightforward reason, which is that the state that commissioned it stopped existing. Soviet spending on the project before 1991 came to approximately $7.85 million, a figure given by the Gemological Institute of America, with Britannica putting it at just under $8 million. The Soviet Union then collapsed, and the project stalled with fewer than 40% of the panels complete. Through most of the 1990s, the reconstructed amber room sat unfinished, a partial replacement for a destroyed original, inside a museum belonging to a state that no longer had the money to finish it. The search for the original carried on, because the search had always cost less than the reconstruction and had always generated more attention. German corporate money restarted the work in 1999, and the specific source deserves stating exactly, because it is one of the most quietly loaded facts in this entire story. Rorgas AG funded it, the German energy company later known as E.ON Rorgas, pledging $3.5 million with the contract signed on the 6th of September, 1999. Rorgas at that time ranked as the largest buyer of Russian gas in Western Europe, and drew roughly one-third of its own gas supply from Russia. Friedrich Spath, the chairman of Rorgas, explained the company's reasoning to the New York Times in terms that were completely open about the symbolism. Spath said the amber room carried enormous emotional weight for both Germany and Russia, and that the room stood as a leading symbol of a time when close German and Russian relations were a model for the world. Read the transaction in full. A room designed and carved in Berlin, given to Russia in 1716 in exchange for grenadiers, expanded in Russia across 2 centuries, seized by German forces in 1941, destroyed in a German castle in 1945, and rebuilt in Russia at the end of the 20th century with money supplied by the German company that bought Russian gas. Total cost of the reconstruction came to $11 million, with one source giving $11.3 million. Of which roughly 3/4 was Soviet state money spent before 1991, and the final push was German corporate money spent after 1999. The Amber Room's history opened as an instrument of alliance politics between Berlin and St. Petersburg. Its reconstruction was funded as an instrument of alliance politics between Berlin and St. Petersburg. The object has served the same purpose, for the same 2 capitals, across 3 centuries in 4 completely different political systems. The reconstructed Amber Room was unveiled at the Catherine Palace on the 31st of May, 2003, timed for the 300th anniversary of the founding of St. Petersburg. Heads of state and government from across Europe were in the city that week for a summit, and the unveiling was staged as a diplomatic event, with the official party ascending the Moneghetti staircase in the afternoon. 24 years of work, $11 million, around 50 craftsmen, 350 shades of amber. More than 6 tons of Baltic stone processed at a yield of 150 grams to the kilogram. All of it reverse-engineered from 86 black and white photographs, 1 color slide, 76 fragments, and an 18th-century chest. Here is the thing the ceremony could not quite say out loud. The reconstruction is an admission. A state does not spend 24 years and $11 million replacing an object it expects to recover. The reconstruction, begun in 1979 and completed in 2003, stands as the clearest institutional statement ever made about the fate of the original Amber Room, and it was made in wood, amber, and gold leaf rather than in a document. Soviet and then Russian authorities built a replacement because at the working level everybody involved understood there was nothing left to bring home. The search never stopped. Reconstruction and search ran in parallel for 24 years, and they continue running in parallel now, which is only possible because they serve different functions. The reconstruction serves the museum, while the search serves the narrative. The reconstructed room today receives approximately 7,000 visitors a day during the peak summer months, according to figures cited by the Gemological Institute of America in its winter 2018 issue. Nobody can book it on its own, because it sits on the standard Catherine Palace route, which means every single visitor to the palace walks through it. Most of them will have been told, before they enter, that the original is still out there somewhere. An argument that only presents its own evidence is not an argument, so here is the strongest available case against everything said so far, stated as fairly as its advocates would state it. Avenir Ovsianov, a Kaliningrad search official, set out the principal Russian counter-argument in 2004, and it comes in three parts, each one serious. Ovsianov argues first that the burned mosaics prove less than they appear to, since the Zoki mosaics were ancillary decoration, and finding 3 burned Florentine stone panels in the castle ruins establishes only that some decorative elements of the amber room were present and burned. It does not establish that the amber panels themselves were in the same place. Second comes a spatial objection that is genuinely difficult. The room where the burned mosaics were found was small, and Ovsianov argues it could not physically have held all the dismantled panels of the amber room. 12 main panels over 3.5 meters high, 8 lower-tier panels, 8 pedestals, cornice elements, and overdur, plus crating, adds up to a very large volume of material, and if it would not fit, it was not there. Third, and this is Ovsianov's strongest point, there is an absence in the ash. The amber room as Rastrelli built it included 24 Venetian mirrors, mirrored pilasters, gilded carving, and bronze fittings, and a fire hot enough to consume 6 tons of amber, and its oak backing should have left melted glass and metal residue behind. Ovsianov's argument holds that no melted glass from the pilasters or mirrors, and no bronze fittings, were reported in the ash, which implies that only the separately packed mosaics burned while the amber panels lay somewhere else. Alongside Ovsianov's technical case sit 3 further points any honest treatment has to concede. Alfred Rohde wrote, on the 12th of January 1945, that he was packing the amber room, and a letter of the same date names a Saxon castle as the destination. That is a documented statement of intent to move the object out of Königsberg, made by the only man in a position to make it, and it stands as the single best piece of evidence the survival theory possesses. The 4th mosaic and the amber chest did survive, which proves that elements of the amber room left the object's custody chain intact and resurfaced in Germany decades later. Dispersal is possible, because dispersal happened. Operation Hannibal was also real, and ships and trains did leave Königsberg and Pillow in the final weeks carrying cargo west, in conditions of total administrative chaos with fragmentary record-keeping. The absence of a shipping manifest for the amber room in 1945 is not, on its own, strong evidence, because a great many things left East Prussia in those weeks without paperwork that survived. Anatoly Kuchemov's position, finally, was not simply denial, since Kuchemov searched the site personally in 1946 and reported that the conclusive whole room fire evidence was not there. That is the counter case, and it is not frivolous. Take Ovsianov's 3 objections in order and test them, because that is how this gets resolved. On the mosaics, Ovsianov is right that mosaics are not panels. Alexander Brusov, however, did not report only mosaics, because Brusov reported burned wooden strips, parts of cases, moldings, and copper hinges from doors taken from Pushkin. Crate fragments are not decoration, crate fragments are the packaging the panels traveled in. On the volume, this objection carries real force and cannot be dismissed. It rests, though, on an assumption about which specific room the crates occupied, inside a castle that had already been bombed in August 1944. Fought over in April 1945, burned afterwards, and then demolished in 1967 and 1968. The building where that volume calculation would have to be tested no longer exists, and the Soviet state removed it. On the absence of melted glass and bronze, Ovsianov's best point deserves a direct answer rather than a deflection, and 2 things weaken it. Brusov did report copper hinges, which means metal fittings from the Pushkin shipment were in fact found in the ash. The room that burned had also been ransacked, fought through, and left open in a captured city for weeks before Brusov arrived on the 5th of June. An argument built on what was not catalogued in ash on a looted, weather exposed site 6 weeks after a city fell is an argument built on a negative under the worst possible conditions for negatives. Then there is the Rohde letter, the honest heart of the survival case. Rohde wrote that he was packing the amber room on the 12th of January, 1945, and the Soviet offensive opened on the 13th. Packing is not shipping. Across 80 years, nobody has produced a single document showing the crates left the building, no manifest, no waybill, no delivery record in Saxony, no German account of receipt, despite exhaustive searching of German, Soviet, Polish, and East German archives, including dedicated KGB and Stasi files. What emerged instead was Paul Feyerabend, saying the crates were in the castle at the moment of surrender. There is a way to test whether an argument is merely unpopular or genuinely threatening, and that way is to publish it and watch what happens. Catherine Scott Clark and Adrian Levy published their book on the Amber Room in 2004, a 416-page work built on Anatoly Kuchemov's own papers and on Soviet and East German archive material. and the book's conclusion matched the one Alexander Brusov had reached in June of 1945. The Amber Room burned at Königsberg, and Soviet authorities knew and did not say. Russia's cultural establishment did not answer with a rebuttal of the evidence, it answered with a statement about intent. The head of the Russian government's culture agency said publicly that such statements were aimed at rewriting history and at discrediting Russia and the role played by its Red Army in the Second World War, and a senior retired Soviet general raised a similar objection. Notice what that response does and does not engage with. It never addresses Brusov's report. It never addresses the copper hinges from Pushkin lying in the ash. It never addresses Paul Feyerabend testifying twice, to two investigators, in 2 different years, that the crates were in the castle at the surrender and burned afterwards. It addresses the consequence of the argument rather than the substance of it. That is exactly what this documentary's thesis predicts. If the Amber Room burned in a Soviet-held castle after the 9th of April, 1945, the finding stops being an art historical question and becomes a question about the conduct of the army that took the city, and the moment a finding touches the memory of the Great Patriotic War, the discussion stops being about hinges and ash. To be fair to the objectors, one specific and non-political counterpoint also entered the record and deserves acknowledging. Adelaida Yokina, a researcher at Pavlovsk, stated that Kuchemov's diaries contain no speculation whatsoever that Soviet forces destroyed the Amber Room. That is a substantive point about the archive rather than about motive, and this script grants it, because Kuchemov's papers do not contain a confession. What they contain is a curator who was handed an eyewitness account of the room burning, on the 2nd of April 1946, and who spent the following decades writing that the room could not have been destroyed. Absence of a confession is not evidence of concealment. It is also not evidence of survival, and it does not touch a single item Brusov found on that floor. Weigh the 2 piles. For destruction, there are the contemporaneous physical findings of the first official investigation, conducted 6 weeks after the city fell, meaning ash across the entire floor, burned wooden strips, crate fragments, and copper hinges shipped from the Catherine Palace. There is an eyewitness, Paul Feyerabend, who managed the castle restaurant, stating that the crates were present at surrender and burned afterwards, and stating it twice, to 2 separate Soviet investigators, in 1945 and again on the 2nd of April, 1946. There is a material that melts between 295 and 395 degrees Celsius, mounted on oak, glued with pine resin and beeswax chosen for its low melting point, and already crazed and photodegraded before the war began. There is a city roughly 80% destroyed, and a castle bombed in 1944, assaulted in 1945, burned, and then demolished by the Soviet state in 1967 and 1968. There is clear institutional motive for a cover-up, resting on the shoulders of the specific curator who had lost the room in 1941. And there are 80 years, more than 130 reported locations, and more than 200 searches producing not one panel. For survival, there is Rodi's letter of intent. There are the Bremen mosaic and the amber chest, both of which left the chain in 1941 rather than 1945. There are Ovsianov's volume and residue objections. And there is the genuine chaos of Operation Hannibal. The preponderance is not close. Physical and testimonial evidence gathered at the site, within weeks, by the investigators sent to find it, supports destruction by fire at Königsberg in April of 1945. Survival theories rest on inference, on a statement of intent never documented as executed, and on 2 authenticated objects that were both separated from the room 4 years before the fire. Which leaves the second half of the thesis, and the question of why an answer available in June of 1945 is still called a mystery in 2026. The mystery has 3 sponsors, and none of them are lying, exactly. The Soviet institution could not survive the sentence that the Red Army burned the Amber Room, and it never had to, because Anatoly Kuchemov handed it a better sentence, which was that the fascists hid it and we will find it. German cultural politics embraced the search as an act of restitution with a physical object at the end, which is a more satisfying form of atonement than an apology. The search industry, meanwhile, requires only that the room might exist, never that it does. 80 years on, the honest position is that the Amber Room is not lost, because lost implies a location. The Amber Room was destroyed, in a burning castle, in a city that no longer carries that name, inside a building that no longer stands, and the ash was photographed and catalogued by a Soviet archaeologist who filed the correct answer 8 weeks after the war in Europe ended and was overruled. The Amber Room exists today, and that sentence needs 3 qualifications. It exists at the Tsarskoye Selo State Museum preserved Pushkin, inside the Catherine Palace, in the same hall Bartolomeo Rastrelli adapted for it in 1755. It is made of Baltic amber from the Kaliningrad region, worked by around 50 craftsmen over 24 years in 350 shades. It is not the room Théophile Gautier described in the 1860s, because that room burned. Access has shifted since 2003. Nobody can book the Amber Room as a separate attraction, since it sits on the standard Catherine Palace route, so every visitor to the palace passes through it. The foreign visitor palace ticket runs at around 2,200 rubles. The museum's official website has not accepted foreign cards since 2022, and several other halls in the palace, the Lion Hall, the Arabesque Hall, Catherine II's private apartments, and the Cameron Gallery, have been under restoration into 2026. Advance tickets are nominal, tied to a name and passport, and open roughly 7 to 30 days ahead. Those are dry logistical facts, and they describe something larger. Since 2022, sanctions and travel disruption have sharply cut Western visitor numbers and complicated payment and access, though the museum remains open to those able to travel. The 7,000 daily summer visitors cited in the winter 2018 figures describe a different world from the one the palace operates in now. The restitution question behind all of this stays entirely unresolved. Large quantities of German-origin cultural property taken as trophy art at the end of the Second World War remain held in Russia, and the wider Russian-German dispute over wartime cultural property has never been settled. The Amber Room sits inside that dispute rather than beside it, which is precisely why calling it lost rather than destroyed has always carried a function beyond sentiment. The search continues. Kaliningrad digs, Baltic wreck dives, and periodic announcements have carried on without interruption, most recently around the buried railway installation found at Mamerki in 2023. No verified discovery of any part of the original Amber Room has been made. The dominant scholarly position holds that the original was destroyed in 1945, and nothing since has disturbed it. Set the politics down for a moment and consider what was actually lost, because it is easy to lose the object inside the argument about the object. What burned in Königsberg was not a pile of gemstones, what burned was a body of knowledge. Gottfried Wolfram, a Danish carver working from 1701, developed a method for laying fossil resin over bronze foil on oak in slices 5 mm thick, held with an adhesive deliberately formulated to soften rather than set hard, joined with mortise and tenon and pegged with ivory, a system engineered so that a material which cracks, crazes, and photodegrades could be made to behave like architecture. Gottfried Thurau and Ernst Schacht of the Danzig Guild carried that method forward, and craftsmen under Catherine II extended it in 1763 with 450 kilograms of new amber over 4 years. Rastrelli then did something that receives far less credit than it deserves. Handed a set of panels sized for a room of 74 square meters, and a hall with over 200 square meters of wall. Rastrelli neither shrank the room nor stretched the amber, and instead built an optical system around the deficit. Mirrored pilasters multiplied the amber that existed, gilded carving carried the eye across the gaps, 24 Venetian mirrors did the rest, and painted imitation amber sat above the cornice where nobody would look closely. The room famous for being solid amber was, in surface area, mostly not amber at all, since it was amber in mirrors and golden paint, arranged by an architect who understood that the effect mattered more than the inventory. That is the achievement the treasure narrative flattens. For 3 centuries the Amber Room has been discussed as a quantity, 6 tons, $500 million, 100,000 pieces, when it was never a quantity at all. It was a solved problem. Several generations of Baltic craftsmen worked out how to build permanent architecture from an impermanent material, and the solution held for 234 years, through 4 relocations, 2 empires, and a revolution, until it was taken off a wall in 36 hours by men with a deadline and a war on. The final irony of the reconstruction is that the problem had to be solved twice. Modern workshops could not simply copy the original, because the original was gone, which meant rewriting the technique from 86 black and white photographs, 1 color slide, 76 burned fragments, Rastrelli's paperwork, and a single signed chest made by Gottfried Thurau, the same Danzig master who had worked on the panels after Wolfram was dismissed in 1707. Thurau's chest taught 20th century craftsmen how to rebuild what Thurau had helped build, and across 280 years that is the only unbroken thread in the entire story. The Amber Room was commissioned in 1701 by a Prussian king who wanted to outdo Versailles, carved by a Dane and 2 men from Danzig, traded east in 1716 in an exchange that also moved between 40 and 55 soldiers in the opposite direction, enlarged by an Italian architect for a Russian empress. extended with 450 kilograms of amber by a Russian ruler, and finished in 1770. Seizure came on the 14th of October, 1941, when officers of the German Army's Ark Protection Service packed it into 27 crates in about 36 hours, and from August of 1942 Königsberg Castle displayed it as an object that had supposedly come home. Back into crates it went after the Royal Air Force bombed Königsberg in August of 1944. Alfred Rohde wrote that he was packing it on the 12th of January, 1945, and the Soviet offensive opened the next day. General Otto Lasch surrendered the city on the 9th of April. In June of 1945, Alexander Brusov walked into the burned northern wing of Königsberg Castle and found ash across the entire floor, burned wooden strips, fragments of cases, and copper hinges carried 800 kilometers from a palace outside Leningrad. Brusov wrote down that the Amber Room had burned. He was almost certainly right, and it took him 8 weeks. Everything since amounts to 80 years of institutions, industries, and sincere private citizens declining to accept a filed report. Alfred Rohde died of typhus in December of 1945 without ever being properly questioned. Erich Koch was kept alive in a Polish prison until the 12th of November, 1986, by 2 intelligence services convinced he knew something, and Koch's answer, when it finally came, was that he had not had time to concern himself with wooden crates. George Stein spent his own money and most of his adult life on the search and was found dead in a Bavarian forest in 1987. Between them, those 3 men account for the entire human core of the mystery, and not one of them ever produced a location. One detail in this story captures the whole of it. Anatoly Kuchumov, standing in the Reich Catherine Palace in March of 1944, wrote in a diary that the sculptures were without heads, that the parquet and fireplaces were smashed and broken, and that if only the walls could talk. 2 years later, in Königsberg, the walls did talk. They were covered in 3 layers of ash, and they were holding the hinges from Kuchumov's own palace, and the man who wrote that line decided he had misheard them. The Amber Room is not waiting in a mine shaft in Saxony, or in a bunker in Poland, or in a sealed crate 88 meters down off the Polish coast. It is ash on the floor of a building the Soviet Union demolished in 1967. The version standing in the Catherine Palace today was built by 50 craftsmen from 86 photographs, and it is the closest thing to the original that will ever exist. That is not a lesser outcome, that is the outcome, and it has been the outcome since June of 1945.